Hi, welcome to this week's video. It's on the Valley of the Kings in ancient Egypt. Now, this video is just an introduction to the Valley of the Kings. It's a really fascinating site and lasted for over 400 years, and there's loads to talk about, but we don't have time to discuss everything today. I've got future videos planned on tomb robbing, mummy caches, how the tombs were constructed, the workmen who built the tombs, and their community in the village in which they lived. So subscribe to watch them all. Ruby. Hi. Right, so these are the books that I have used for this Valley of the Kings research. I didn't really use this one much. I just wanted to confirm some points I was making. So I've got the book by Chris Naunton, Searching for the Lost Tombs of Egypt. Ian Shaw's edited the Oxford History of Ancient Egypt. Catherine Bard's An Introduction to the Archaeology of Ancient Egypt. Reeves and Wilkinson's The Complete Valley of the Kings, and Dodson and Nick Graham's The Tomb in Ancient Egypt. I found the most valuable information in Oxford History and Complete Valley of the Kings. I was kind of disappointed by Catherine Bard's book. It wasn't that informative, but I know obviously there's a huge amount of information that you can include in a book about the Valley of the Kings, and she had a limited number of words that she could talk about, so it's kind of unsurprising. And this is my New Kingdom notebook. Apologies for the light. It's dawn. Well, it's after dawn, and we're getting some lovely glare. This is my book that I'm writing my New Kingdom notes in. And actually, I didn't write that many notes in here on the Valley of the Kings because I decided to do a new approach. I'm just trying to find the page, which is do it via a mind map. Okay, so that is the first draft of the mind map that I drew, which was the main themes of the Valley of the Kings and then topics of discussion. And then I transferred it to the mind map software I use, which is called QuickFlow. So I'll show you that in a second. Here's the actual script that I wrote that I was using to do the actual video. And here is my QuickFlow mind map. As you can see, it's tiny because there's so much of it. It can't fit it on the screen without zooming out a lot. So I will zoom in more and show you it quickly. Here's 50%. Oh, where's it gone? Down there. Because you don't need to read it, but it's basically, the mind map isn't exactly a spider diagram, which would have been better because it would have filled across a landscape page better, as your computer screen is landscape. But I have been putting quick notes and some more detailed notes in here, and the colours don't really make sense anymore. They didn't really make sense to start with. I put black in there to sort of indicate not to include them in this episode and to put them in future episodes, videos, whatever. And then the sort of dark pink was what I had included at that point when I stopped using the mind map, because what happens with me is I get to the point where I have successfully sort of memorized all the key points, and then I don't need to use the mind map anymore. What I did actually, because as you can see, there's loads of topics and information in here, is I started writing it and I thought, oh my goodness, I can't fit everything in here in the video. I just cannot. It's just such an interesting subject and there's so much to talk about. So I decided to write questions, and they were based on who, what, when, where, how, why. So it's things like, what did the tombs look like? Who built them? Who was buried in them? who wasn't buried in them? Why was this site chosen? Why were the tombs in the form that they were in or are in? That kind of thing. So that's what became my script. The Valley of the Kings is a strange place to visit, a paradox. You're standing in the middle of a dry riverbed where hundreds of thousands of years ago water flowed well over your head, surrounded by tourists in a place where few people were allowed to tread. You hear the hubbub and excitement that comes with visiting one of the most famous sites of ancient Egypt, but where more than 3,000 years ago silence was supposed to reign. In between the clanging and banging of tools and calls to fellow workmen excavating stone from the current pharaoh's tomb, and mere decades ago excited shouts from archaeologists excavating these tombs in a different way. The landscape has barely changed if you don't look closely, with sand-coloured cliffs rising over 100 metres above your head on both sides. But then you see the entrances to the tombs and you're witnessing something you were never supposed to see. The locations of the final resting places of the New Kingdom pharaohs. When you venture inside one of these tombs, walking further and further down a narrow passageway, navigating stairs and sloping ramps, and eventually emerging into chambers and pillared halls, decorated with texts and scenes from the Netherworld texts now commonly known as the Book of the Dead, and then eventually into the burial chamber that nobody was supposed to enter, with a massive stone sarcophagus that the pharaoh really laid in, it's difficult to realise that you are dozens of metres inside the Theban mountain chain. Reverse your journey and emerge blinking into the bright sunshine, and it's still more difficult to imagine that over 30 large tombs are carved deep into those cliffs, almost like worm tunnels. This week's study/productivity/ADHD tip is to do batch cooking. So this is a big saucepan of spaghetti bolognese that my mum is making, and it's going to do about 8 portions maybe, which is great to be able to fill up the freezer. You can do loads of different ones and freeze them, get them out to defrost, and then microwave them, so that if you're on a very busy study day or if you're in an ADHD hyperfocus, you don't have to worry about cooking, and you can always guarantee that you're going to be able to have something that's healthy and nutritious, rather than doing what I have done previously, particularly at university, which is like grab one of those big bags of crisps and just eat half of that for dinner, and then wonder why I feel low in energy and miserable later. So it doesn't have to be something like a big bowl of a big saucepan of something. It could be just, if you're making something today, just double the portion. So if you're making a stir fry, just chop double the vegetables, use double the protein. Or any other, if you make a quick spaghetti bolognese or a quick chili con carne or something like that, just make double, and then you can have the same again tomorrow, and then you can plan for tomorrow to maybe be a study day. The Valley of the Kings is the most impressive royal cemetery in the world, being home to the tombs of 25 pharaohs of the New Kingdom, some queens, some princes, and even some non-royals who were favoured by the king and granted permission to have a burial or tomb there. Many of the tombs are huge and magnificent, as would befit a king, but some are smaller, such as Tutankhamun's, and some are unfinished, as they would have had to rush to complete them after the tomb owner had died. The tombs were painstakingly prepared over the course of years by professional workmen hired by the government. These workers chiselled out many thousands of tons of limestone from the valley cliffs in order to build each tomb. They chiselled it smooth, plastered over it, and then drew and painted, or carved and then painted, the intricate scenes and texts that we all know from pictures of the Valley of the King's Tombs that are commonly known as the Book of the Dead. However, from the outside, most of these tombs would not have looked so remarkable. In fact, they would have looked like nothing, the entrances resembling the rock of the cliffs themselves, in order to hide them from tomb robbers. The Valley of the Kings, as it's known today, is part of a dried-up riverbed where, around 1 million years ago, the Nile and its tributaries carved through and eroded away the limestone and shale layers of this part of the Theban mountain chain. The water later receded and left behind this dry valley or wadi. The cliffs are over 100 metres tall in places, looked down upon by a pyramid-shaped mountain peak that rises 240 metres above the valley floor. It's a very impressive sight geologically, even if it weren't for the tombs that are located there. In the two branches of the valley, there are around 64 tombs or burials that have been discovered so far. Some are in the western branch, but most are in the eastern, with 25 tombs or so belonging to pharaohs. Most of the tomb entrances are positioned low against the valley floor or into rock spurs, and a few high up in the cliff wall, such as the tomb of Thutmose III, today accessed by a long wooden staircase. But in ancient times, all but the latest tombs would have had their entrances made invisible. The site was used as a royal cemetery for nearly the whole of the New Kingdom, from almost the beginning of the 18th dynasty and throughout the whole of the 19th and 20th dynasties. It's of course home to the famous tomb of Tutankhamun and almost every other king of the New Kingdom. Instead of listing the pharaohs who were buried there, as it's practically all of them, it's easier to list those who weren't. Specifically, the first king of the New Kingdom, Ahmose, as the valley hadn't been founded yet. Possibly his successor, Amenhotep I, whose tomb location is a matter of debate. Thutmose II, whose tomb was located nearby but not in this valley. Akhenaten, the so-called heretic king who chose to be buried at his capital city Amarna, but whose mummy was probably relocated to the Valley of the Kings during the reign of Tutankhamun. Akhenaten's successor Smenkhare and Ramesses VIII, both of whose tombs have either not yet been found or not yet confirmed. There were also some queens buried here in tombs near their husbands, and some princes, including notably the huge tomb today labelled KV5, which was built by Ramesses II as the burial place for his sons. The king could also grant permission for a burial or tomb for non-royals, such as his close friends and important officials, as King Amenhotep II did for his friend and vizier Amenemopet. The pharaohs who were buried here, their architects and officials designed the kingly tombs with care, gradually changing and improving on previous layout, features and decoration for the current king's tomb. While each tomb was unique, they generally shared key elements. The whole of the tomb was set within the interior of the cliff and often below ground level, with the entrances leading to passages with steps or sloping corridors or both alternating, which led to a number of halls and chambers, and eventually the burial chamber where the king would rest for eternity inside his coffins and stone sarcophagus. The chambers, and possibly the pillared hall and the passageway, were decorated by skilled artists who carefully drafted the designs, then either painted over the designs or sculptors carved into the stone and then the artists painted over them. We don't have time to discuss the decoration in detail today, but they were scenes and texts from the collection of magical spells of the Netherworld texts, often now generally called the Book of the Dead. These provided the deceased pharaoh's soul with maps or models of the underworld and the heavens, as well as other helpful scenes to aid him in successfully navigating to the afterlife, where he would rule as king alongside the sun god Ra. After death, the tomb was stocked with objects that the king's soul would need to enjoy a successful afterlife. It's very difficult to know what most of the individual kings included in their tombs, as unfortunately practically all of them were heavily looted. But of course the tomb of Tutankhamun and some extant objects from the tombs of Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, Thutmose IV and Horemheb provide us with some evidence. The pharaoh's heavy stone sarcophagus was positioned within the burial chamber, into which the coffins containing his mummy would go, and around which gilded wooden shrines would be erected to enclose the whole arrangement, as was found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. The king's canopic jars, within or without a stone canopic chest, contained the organs removed from the deceased during the mummification process and was also buried in the tomb. The king would have many objects of daily life inside the tomb so that he would be comfortable after death. Furniture, jewellery, cosmetics, games, weapons, writing material, musical instruments and other personal items. There would also be ritual items that had a magical role, such as shabtis that would perform the king's boring manual labour duties so that he wouldn't have to do them after death, model boats and chariots to transport the king to the afterlife, and so-called Osiris beds, which were wooden trays in the shape of the god Osiris, god of the afterlife, which were planted with grain seeds that were supposed to germinate after the funeral and the tomb had been sealed, which symbolised life continuing after death. These tombs are of a dramatically different form than earlier kings' tombs. For over 1500 years, such tombs were constructed with a magnificent and highly visible superstructure, most of the time a pyramid, with the largest of them being visible from miles away. These monuments demonstrated the pharaoh's might, wealth, and ability to command resources in the form of materials and manpower. Both royal and non-royal tombs were a portal to the underworld, from where the deceased's soul would venture after the funeral to voyage to the afterlife, and where his or her soul, in the form of a bar bird, would return to the tomb to take advantage of the offerings that were left to them. The deceased's body was to be kept safe inside their coffin in the sealed burial chamber, so they could be resurrected into the afterlife, and so their bar soul could find their mummy in the tomb. Royal funerary complexes also contained temples where priests would honour the deceased king, perform rituals for his deceased soul and funerary statue, and make offerings. This was the system that had been used for centuries. So why was it changed in the Valley of the Kings, where the tombs had no superstructure and no connected mortuary temple? Why was this specific site chosen to be the location of the pharaoh's tombs in the New Kingdom? The answer to the first question, as already briefly mentioned, was to try to prevent tomb robberies. The superstructures of kings' tombs in the past had made it obvious where robbers could find their loot. They were a giant signpost saying gold, jewellery, treasure in here. Breaking in, the robbers would desecrate the sacredness of the sealed tomb, as well as stealing the grave goods that were provided for the king's soul to enjoy a comfortable life after death. However, the valuables weren't just inside the burial chamber of the tomb. They were also inside the mummy's wrappings, as the king would have been wearing some of his favourite or symbolic jewellery and magical amulets. When trying to access these, the robbers could damage or even destroy the king's mummy, risking his ability to successfully resurrect in the afterlife. Royal architects tried for hundreds of years to prevent robbers from being able to break into kings' tombs. But despite multiple architectural methods that, to be honest, sound like Indiana Jones-esque booby traps, which we will discuss in an upcoming video on tomb robbery, the robbers did succeed. Therefore, the pharaohs and the royal architects at the very beginning of the New Kingdom tried a different tactic: to build these tombs in a secluded location and make their entrances look invisible. So why this specific location? Throughout the majority of pharaonic history, the majority of kings' tombs had been built in the northern half of Egypt. And the New Kingdom pharaohs could have easily chosen to build their tombs near the political centre of Memphis or anywhere else. However, the move to the Theban region wasn't that strange. It was a politically, historically, and spiritually incredibly important location. The Valley of the Kings was located past the West Bank, across the river from Thebes. This was one of Egypt's two most important cities during the New Kingdom and Egypt's religious centre. It was home to the state god Amun and the temples of Karnak and Luxor. It was also the home of the founder of the New Kingdom, King Ahmose, who had reunified Egypt after the Second Intermediate Period, as well as to King Mentuhotep II, who had done the same after the First Intermediate Period. The wider Theban necropolis was already home to the Saf tombs of Intef I, the Second and the Third, who were the Theban rulers of the First Intermediate Period, as well as the temple tomb of their successor Mentuhotep II. These tombs had been partially or wholly carved into the mountainside, just as the tombs of the Valley of the Kings would be hundreds of years later. The choice of burying the New Kingdom pharaohs in the Theban necropolis and into the cliffs themselves therefore followed in their tradition rather than being a brand new location and form for royal burials. And tradition was very important for ancient Egyptian kingship. The specific location of the Valley of the Kings is very important symbolically, which is one of the main reasons why the first pharaoh buried here chose this site and why his successors continue to use it. This royal cemetery is on the western side of the Nile, which is the traditional place where cemeteries were located. As the sun sets in the west, representing death, and then rises in the east, representing the resurrection of the deceased's soul. In fact, the Theban Massif, the chain of mountains and cliffs here, appears to have a dip in the middle into which the sun appears to set when viewed from the city across the other side of the Nile. It looks like the ancient hieroglyph Akhet, meaning horizon and representing the sunrise and sunset. The Valley of the Kings is directly behind this dip, so it looks like the sun is setting into it. So it's the perfect place to locate tombs. The Massif is also home to the peak of the mountain here, called in ancient times Dehenet, or now Kurna or El Kern. This peak was sacred to the goddess Hathor, and later became deified as a personified goddess called Merit Sega. From the perspective of inside the valley, looking up 240 metres, the peak looks like a pyramid. So even though kings were no longer buried inside a pyramid complex, as had been the tradition for the majority of pharaonic history, it was as though their tombs were the substructure to this natural pyramid-like superstructure. Going back to the first question, this specific location was chosen for the practical reason of trying to prevent looting. The valley is just behind Deir el-Bahri, which is a bay of the Theban cliffs in the low desert, the floor and cliff sides of which are home to the temple tomb of Mentuhotep II, the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, and a temple of Thutmose III. As such, the valley is hidden to the eyes of people who are looking across the river from Thebes, or those visiting the West Bank. So it's one of those places that you wouldn't know it was there unless you already knew or were shown. It was also quite remote, a couple of hours arduous walk through the desert from the nearest village if you weren't aware of the shortcut over the top of the cliffs. So few people should have gone exploring around there. Additionally, the entrance to the valley itself is quite narrow, so it would have been assessed as easy to guard. So these factors combined to provide one of the main reasons why the first pharaoh buried here chose this site. It was theoretically the ideal location for his tomb, to restrict access to this site from would-be tomb robbers. Were the king's hopes for protection of their tombs and prevention of looting justified? Did the new tactics work? Well, actually no. Almost all of the tombs were robbed and practically emptied, with the exception of Tutankhamun's, which was actually broken into twice, and the robbers made off with about 60% of the jewellery stored in one of the chambers. But they were caught and didn't disturb the burial itself. This tomb and this pharaoh are among the most famous discoveries from ancient Egypt. But in fact, the stories of the robberies of the other tombs are even more interesting and shocking. So please subscribe to watch my upcoming video on this subject.
I'll see you next time.